Hi, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Displacement, Migration and Integration seminar series. My name is Gareth Nellis. I'm an assistant professor of political science at the University of California, San Diego, where I research elections and internal migration in South Asia. This event is being organized by Evidence in Governance and Politics, or EGAP. EGAP is a research, evaluation, and learning network, a kind of community of practitioners and policymakers who've banded together to foster knowledge accumulation and evidence-based policy in a variety of governance and accountability domains. EGAP has recently established a set of priority themes to help structure and organize these activities. The goal is to discuss live issues and questions at the forefront of these various fields and pave the way for important, exciting, and hopefully high-impact work going forward. Today's panel is the first seminar event for the Displacement, Migration, and Integration priority theme. So the focus of this theme is the safety and well-being of individuals displaced by violence, disasters, or other hardships, or who are moving for economic opportunities. You can read more about this theme on the EGAP website, and there'll be a link dropped in the chat now. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive on a single study talking about a new, really fascinating project about information and irregular migration run in Nigeria. We're delighted to have three of the researchers from this project here to talk about the work today. Bernd Beber is senior researcher at the Leibniz Institute for Economic Research, or RWI, based in the Institute's Berlin office. Bernd's work focuses on the political economy of conflict and development, the role of international institutions in fragile societies, and the drivers and effects of migration, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Next, we have Emeka Eluemunor, who is the country director for Innovations for Poverty Action in Nigeria. He has decades of experience conducting research on development programs in Nigeria, Tanzania, and Uganda. IPA, many of you will have heard of, specializes in running randomized control trials. It was founded in 2002 and has worked in more than 50 countries all over the globe. And as you know, it's become a really pivotal actor in this space. Last, we have Alexandra Scacco, who is Senior Research Fellow and Vice Director of the Institutions and Political Inequality Units at the Berlin Social Science Center, or WZB. Alex studies individual decisions under conditions of extreme risk, and we'll see many of those extreme risks in evidence today. She's done really path-breaking projects on communal violence, prejudice, and intergroup contact, and now this new strand of work too on migration. Logistics for today's event. If you have a question or comment, we encourage you to type it into the chat's message box, and time permitting, we'll review them at different points during the discussion. The event is being recorded and will be available as a video posted on the EGAP website, along with a Q&A.
So sorry. Yeah, so sorry, I kept you waiting.
Please, Matthew. Will be available with a Q&A feature after the event. EGAP will turn the audio into a podcast so you can listen while driving to work, going for a walk, cooking dinner. Feel free to keep your video on or off. Just please do stay muted throughout, but make generous use of the chat feature. Okay, without further ado, let's get into the meat of the discussion. Alex, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. Could you tell us, please, what is the real-world problem that this study is trying to address?
Yes, thank you so much, Gareth. Okay. So hundreds of thousands of irregular migrants have tried to reach Europe from West Africa over the past decade. Irregular migration routes are extremely dangerous and exploitative, and horrific abuses, such as forced labor, forced sex work, even death are commonplace along the route. And very few who attempt the route actually succeed in reaching Europe. The IOM estimates that as many as 100,000 Nigerians who attempted to irregularly migrate across the desert and the sea are currently stranded in prisons in Libya. And among the few who do make it to Europe, The overwhelming majority are refused asylum. Unfortunately, though, there remains virtually no legal path to migration for most Nigerians to Europe. So all of these features together have kind of culminated in a staggering humanitarian crisis. So our study asks whether providing information about the risks of the journey across the desert and the sea and the likelihood of being allowed to stay in Europe can shift beliefs about these risks. We're wondering if it will shift interest in attempting this journey, and then to see if the information shifts actual migration decisions.
Amazing. Thanks, Alex. So I just wanted to ask, what is the kind of the fundamental constraint that this intervention is designed to overcome? This seems like it's a really high stakes decision for potential migrants, literally one of life or death, and you're providing them some information, but why don't they seek out this information and acquire it by themselves, given that it could be kind of so valuable to them? In what sense is this kind of adding some new information into their sort of decision calculus?
This is such an important question. It's possibly like the theoretical question. So yes, given how incredibly risky, the enormity of the potential costs, and frankly, the enormity of the potential benefits, particularly material benefits for those few irregular migrants who do reach Europe, this is high stakes. And you would think that it's rational to invest time and resources into getting as much information as possible about both the benefits and the risk side. So, why does throwing a bit more information into this environment, why would it make any difference? And so this is super interesting. People certainly do invest in trying to become informed about this. This is an enormously popular activity attempting this route in this particular region of Nigeria that we study. But there are a few features of the setting that serve to distort the information environment and kind of serve as barriers to accessing balanced information. So first of all, as we learned, so I should note, we've been doing research in this one region in Nigeria, the South-South, since 2017. And so we've done a lot of qualitative work and survey work before even trying to start any type of RCT. And in this preliminary work, we learned that smugglers and traffickers are thick on the ground. There are many of them in this region. They're very powerful and influential, and they have incredible incentives to distort information about how expensive and how risky the trip is. So they do. Second, available narratives are highly skewed towards kind of rare success stories. It's easy to find Nigerian migrants who, for example, reach Sicily, and you can find them on Instagram, sharing photos of new friends, delicious food and adventures that they're having. But people stuck in Libyan prisons are obviously not communicating their narratives. And interestingly, this skewing happens even along tight social networks, so even within households. So during our qualitative research, we heard about lots of stories of people who had reached Italy, for example, and who were a bit embarrassed to talk about their actual living conditions with their parents if things hadn't turned out as they hoped, or almost for the other reason, didn't really want to give a lot of information for fear of pressures to kind of redistribute the few resources that they had obtained. So all of these things kind of combine to make it easy to find information about success stories and harder to find kind of accurate information about sort of the less successful stories and what actually happens along the route itself. Thanks.
So the information environment is kind of being muddied and distorted, or in every place, from the migrants who make it to the destination regions and in the origin areas that you're working.
Right.
Thanks. Emeka, could we turn to you to maybe think a little bit more now about sort of how this project was run? This wasn't an entirely conventional relationship between sort of partner and research team. So could you tell me a bit more about that relationship? What was the role of the implementing partner in this case? Were there any sort of points of tension that came up while doing this work?
Thanks, Gareth. So it's been a fantastic relationship with the research team. This project was one of the first for the Nigeria country office, actually starting out when we were trying to find our fit. So there were a couple of teething problems. But in terms of how we worked, the research team provided intellectual leadership, with IPA contributing as a thought partner and bringing in local context. We generally worked very closely. We needed to adapt certain aspects of the on-ground implementation, based on the practicalities. And IPA usually is not an implementer, but it made sense for us to be an implementer for this project because the first treatment was embedded in the baseline data collection. And so we worked closely with the research team to monitor the implementation of the treatment, as well as the data collection. As usual, ensuring rigor and high quality across both of these activities. And the second treatment was slightly different. It was delivered outside of the data collection rounds. And for this, we also work closely to not just develop the content, but also administer them through social media channels. I want to talk a little bit about the content in a bit.
Thanks, Emeka. Sorry.
So just on the points of tension, yeah. So it's been a very collaborative relationship with the team, but that's with many relationships, there are often some tensions. And one of those points was with the need to comply with Nigeria's data protection regulation. For some of you who may not know, here in Nigeria, we have a somewhat complex data protection regulation, which came into effect in 2020. So IP has been through the process of setting up systems to comply with this, and successfully we've undertaken 2 audits under it. But that said, there were implications for this study. For instance, the need for the additional information required in the consenting process made it a lot longer and more complex. And then also because of the direct consent that was required to get personal data, it became challenging for us to collect the additional information to help us with tracking our main respondents. So not surprisingly, this was very frustrating for the PIs. But we worked together to refine and optimize the consent form and develop creative ways to collect household member information. So in general, it's been a great partnership.
Thanks, Emeka. And in what year did this project get started?
So the pre-baseline work was done in 2018 before the Nigerian office started, but then the baseline started in 2019.
Got it. Thanks. Maybe we can talk later how COVID may have impacted some of the fieldwork as well. And we'll also come back to some of these ethical issues, Emeka, that you gestured towards also in a second. First, Bernd, I wanted to turn to you. So, looking at this as a researcher, I could immediately see some potential challenges here, sort of a primary one being that relatively few people migrate. So how do you identify this pool of potential migrants as a kind of a site to work in? And how also did your initial surveys shape the course of this study? I know that this was something where you did a lot of scoping work trying to get a really rich understanding of the area you're working first. So it'd be great if you could tell us some more about that.
Yeah, this is a really important point, and one that sometimes is at risk of being forgotten in some political discourse, the fact that relatively few people migrate. But of course, it's a challenge that researchers in this field, are well aware of. As one reason why you often see intent to migrate or beliefs about migration features outcomes, but not actual migration particularly often. So the first thing that helped us here is that another thing that's maybe not always obvious, in the discourse around migration is that migrant populations or populations of potential migrants tend to be very concentrated. So in the case of Nigeria, much migration, in particular irregular migration, comes from the south, where we worked in Edo and Delta states, and even within that region, in particular from Edo state, and even within that state, in particular from the capital city, from Benin City. So a disproportionate share of Nigerians that embark on the journey across the desert and the sea are from Benin City. So that helped in terms of constructing a sample that would yield not just potential migrants, but actual migrants in at our end line as well. So we concentrated, we worked in Edo and Delta, and then oversampled from Benin in particular. We also restricted our sample to adults aged 18 to 39, right? So that's usually the population that tends to embark on this journey. But at the same time, we also wanted to work with a representative sample, right? So we wanted to be able to say something about really any kind of, adults in that vulnerable population to a certain extent. And that combining that is not particularly easy, right? For one thing, constructing a representative sample in this area is not very easy. We didn't have a readily available sampling frame, so we actually geolocated. We identified all buildings in Edo and Delta State to get a random sample, again with oversampling in those particular areas. And then once we had our sample, we tracked all members of households. So in order to square that circle of having a representative sample, but at the same time also identify actual migrants, you need to make your sample large, right? So it's not just enough to oversample, but you really gotta throw a lot at this. So that meant a large sample of households to begin with, and then tracking all members of participating households at endline. So we, as you mentioned, we did the scoping survey first in 2018, and then our RCT, the scoping survey actually just in Benin City, and then the RCT in all of Edo and Delta. And that was actually extremely helpful in terms of designing the intervention. So one thing that you find in the literature is a lot of discussion about what makes people move, but actually not quite as much evidence as you would expect about what people believe, right? What their beliefs are about different types of journeys. So in particular, in this context, it was quite helpful for us to get that data first.
Thanks, Bernd. And there's a really terrific working paper about those beliefs. Hopefully will be available soon for people to read. Let's kind of get to some key parts now, some really important details. So let's talk about the intervention itself. This was an intensive, multi-pronged intervention, certainly relative to most informational treatments I've seen, which tend to be more light touch. Alex, could you tell us about the various parts of this intervention? And perhaps also kind of in what sense was this an informational intervention in the standard vein of simply trying to address beliefs through a purely rational information channel, or were you also trying to play to people's emotions? Could you tell us something about that?
Yes, thanks so much. So yes, so the information treatment was embedded in our baseline survey, and the plan was not so much, subtlety and trying to tease out very nuanced mechanisms, but really just establishing possibility. So we combined a lot of things together. We have sort of three main components. And as you said, it's a little bit on the heavier side in terms of information treatment. So for all of the components together, it took on average about 15 minutes to administer during the baseline. And so we have three pieces. So we have a factual script that triangulates information from a lot of sources, from the UNHCR, from IOM, from the US State Department, and it talks about particular risks along the journey. So likelihood of experiencing forced labor, forced sex work, experiencing assault, even likelihood of death along the route. Then a comprehensive set of information about, for the small set of those who do reach Europe, what are the likelihood that a Nigerian who arrives in Italy actually is allowed to stay legally, is granted asylum. So very fact heavy. Then the second component is what we call sort of a motivated reasoning exercise, where we used actually the information from our 2018 pre-survey, where we asked people, hey, what do you think your chances are? If you tried this, how likely is it that you would reach Europe. If you reached Europe, how likely is it that you would be able to stay? And so we actually created some visual images, trying to make it as clear and straightforward as possible, comparing people's estimates of their own likelihood of success versus our best estimates from the various available sources of what the numbers really do look like. And as you can imagine, people vastly overestimated relative to our best approximation of the truth. So that was the second part. And we did that in a very kind of engaging, active way, full of active processing kind of steps. Then the third part was what you alluded to, Gareth. So, we have facts, we have a bit about motivated reasoning, and then the last part was just sort of testimonials. So publicly available video footage from various news sources we compiled. And these are migrants who attempted the route and were repatriated or who encountered challenges along the way. And so that really was a more of an emotional approach. Like, let me tell you in our own words how this happened and how it felt. So they're all together. This is not something, therefore, we can disentangle from this first intervention. It could be any of these things. It could be some of them. It could be all of them are necessary together to shift beliefs and behavior. But we do have a second experiment that we're in the middle of implementing that decomposes these and just, uses one out of the three. And so we can see down the road if some of them are more effective than others.
Thanks, Alex. Graham Blair asked a question in the chat, which Bernd answered. Bernd, could you just summarize? So Graham asked, why would people trust this source of information given that they're getting bad information from so many actors around them? Ben, could you just give a brief
I actually answered the other question about sampling, but on Graham's point, yeah, I mean, that's a really important one as well. So obviously in terms of being transparent and in terms of obtaining consent, it has to be clear that we as Western researchers are involved, but all the interactions locally were done by local staff and with also a letter of support from the local university, from the University of Benin. So it's clear that there was some, buy-in sort of from local stakeholders, and we also made it clear and we reminded people that we're not representing the government, neither the Nigerian government nor European government. We also asked at the end, did they think that we are in fact just researchers, or are we government representatives? And for the most part, did seem like they did believe that we were just interested in getting an honest opinion. So we reminded them at various points in the survey that this is really just about getting an honest reflection of what's happening in terms of migration in those states. But it is, as you point out, a challenge.
I think a question that's going to arise in such an important but controversial topic are the ethics of this intervention. So you talk about the decision to migrate as a cost-benefit calculation, but your intervention really only provides information on the risks or the sort of the negatives of migrating. Couldn't that be pushing people away from undertaking a journey that might ultimately benefit them? Are you maybe stacking the decks against migration here? How did you think about these ethical conundrums, Bernd?
Yeah, I mean, we did stack the deck against this particular type of migration, for sure, right? So we looked at the situation and figured this is the kind of migration that is really migration that people, if they don't know what they're getting into in terms of exposure to smugglers, in terms of exposure to death, injury, potential enslavement, may not want to get into. And at the very least, they should have as much information about the journey along the Mediterranean route as we can give them. So we did make sure that at no point during the intervention, we told them what we think they should do, right? So this was one important component of this. We didn't say, you should not migrate, but here's information about what lies ahead, if you decide to to follow the Mediterranean route. But you're exactly right. Migration in general is often welfare improving, in particular for migrants. So we try to think hard about this and try to think of this in a participant-centered way. But it doesn't mean that we couldn't have unexpected effects, right? Even effects that we might think are undesirable from the perspective of your typical development economist. But I think if that's the case, that's particularly important to learn about those unexpected effects, right? If even an intervention that's designed in this kind of, we try to design it in this participant-centered fashion, has these effects, then maybe we should reconsider information campaigns altogether. And this is a intervention that's designed in this fashion, differently from many government-sponsored interventions, which are much more aggressively about deterring migration.
Thanks. Alex, lots of great questions coming up in the chat, which we'll turn to later. Just a point of clarification, was the intervention targeted at individuals or the household? Uchenna Efobi asks.
Great. Yes. So the information was given to all members of the household who were present when we conducted the interview with the primary respondent. So we randomly sampled households and we randomly sampled individuals who fit the age range that was appropriate. But then we gathered anyone who was around because, power is a huge challenge here and we wanted to make sure to reach as many people as possible.
Thanks, Alex.
Gareth, am I allowed to jump in on the ethics? I saw a really nice question and an important one in the chat from someone about, could you accidentally encourage irregular migration?
Please
and
do.
Yeah, this is a huge reason why this was not our initial plan. We initially planned to have an intervention that affected both, that looked at both the costs and the benefit side. But we learned from our pre-survey that while there was loads of uncertainty about risks of the journey, people were quite savvy about the benefits of Europe. And if anything, they underestimated the potential economic benefits of Europe. So at first we thought, hey, wow, this is important, so let's do both sides. But we actually benefited from a wonderful and very informative ethics session that EGAP sponsored because this project was so clearly full of ethical questions. So, and I think it was in Wageningen a few years ago, 50 wonderful scholars and practitioners sat down and thought about this with us and decided we needed a red line and that if there was any risk of accidentally encouraging migration and leading to excess deaths in the desert, we simply couldn't do it. So it was a really tough decision, for the reasons Bernd mentioned, but at the end we decided to take out the side about the benefits of Europe and focus on the risks where there was a lot of uncertainty and it wouldn't accidentally lead to excess dangerous irregular migration.
Great. Thanks to Jessica Gottlieb for that great question. Let's try and preview some results now. So midline data collection is complete. Alex, could you give us a sort of a taste of what the initial study results now are?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'm going to give like 2 seconds more on what we found in our pre-survey, and then Bernd's going to jump in with the RCT results in a minute. So just kind of continuing on from before. So we asked, sort of backing up for a second, it makes sense before you do a big information-centered RCT to find out what people know and believe ex ante, right? You have to provide information that's relevant to people and that isn't something that they already know. So in the pre-survey, we asked loads of questions about Europe. What is the average life expectancy in the EU? What's the average monthly wage in Italy? What's the average employment benefit weekly in the UK? Like really detailed questions. And people were super savvy and, right on target in some cases and sort of a little bit underestimating in other cases. When we turned to the risk side, we found that the answers were really all over the place. Like the distributions were almost flat. Like people really kind of had a vague sense this was dangerous, but they didn't know how long the route typically took people. They didn't know key things like, what type of transportation do people even use? Where do they go on this route? So this led us to kind of really narrow the focus on the risks. And we used all of this information in designing the RCT. And now I'll let Bernd talk about the more recent stuff.
Yeah, so in terms of results of the RCT, we had three outcomes of interest, three types of outcomes of interest: beliefs about the risks, intent to migrate, in particular intent to follow land, that is, try to migrate regularly, and then actual migration behavior. So first, we actually see large effects on beliefs and intent expressed right after treatment. So that's a first step, just to check if the intervention even resonates. So on average, you see that estimated death rates go from something like 33% up by 14%. So it almost doubles. And you see similar effects for what participants guess happens in terms of injuries, sexual abuse, and exposure to slavery. And you also, right after treatment, see a reduction in interest in following land by about 8 or 9 percentage points from about 22% that are interested in the control group. So both of these, very large and substantively meaningful effects. That's right after treatment, as you would expect to see effects there. Now, interestingly, they do persist at endline. So at endline, they're still substantively meaningful and significant. They're about a third of the magnitude. So you're looking at an increase in the estimated death rate, for example, by something like 5 percentage points, a reduction in interest by about 3 percentage points. So they're given the control group mean, they're sizable effects. And they persist after about a year, right? So the follow-up, we try to schedule the follow-up so it happens after a full cycle of migration, right? So full annual cycle, and that's interesting to see. Now, the maybe most interesting part, of course, is what happens to behavior. So we actually see changes in terms of people moving away from their baseline locations, and we do so. We see first that people are less likely to leave their town. So mobility in Nigeria is high. So about 30% of our in the control group leave their town and move elsewhere in Nigeria. So it's a high mobility, as we already described, high mobility environment. And that's reduced by about 4%. 4% in the control group, right? The control group mean leave Nigeria, that's reduced by about 1%. In terms of leaving for Europe, that's about 2%, reduced by 0.5%. Following land, that's in the control group, affects about 1%. That's about 80 plus people in our sample in total, actually in our entire sample. And we see close to 1/3% of a reduction there. So it all goes in the expected direction. Now, those last two effects, they're not distinguishable statistically from zero, because we're starting from a very low base, and a base, of course, that in COVID times was even smaller. You see this, big disconnect between lots of mobility within Nigeria, but much less going outside of Nigeria. Now, relative to the control group mean, the effects are actually still relatively large. So that's about a reduction of 1/4, right? Even in terms of the share that leave to follow land, to migrate irregularly along this route. But interestingly, all these types of behavior, remember, we focused in the intervention very much on migrating regularly. But we see effects here on all these types of mobility. And in fact, the ones that we're able to estimate, with statistical confidence, they're not about irregular migration, they're about leaving your town in particular, right? So there's a certain irony to this, because the type of mobility that perhaps some of these information campaigns even want to encourage, right? They want people to not migrate irregularly or try to reach Europe, but perhaps migrate towards economic opportunities domestically. That's actually also a type of mobility that we see reduced in our study. So I think this should, maybe give us a pause, maybe also give us pause with respect to what these information campaigns more generally do.
Thanks, Bernd. So, using this bundle, this modality for delivering information, you did come up with a highly impactful intervention, especially by the sort of standards of most information campaigns, but it may have had this unintended consequence of impacting, sort of placing negative pressure on internal migration, which wasn't the first order goal of the study. Thanks, Bernd. Finally, from sort of my set of questions, Emeka, midline is now complete. I think endline is in the field. Is that right? So soon, you're going to have a package of findings here from this hugely ambitious study. What's the plan for disseminating those results going forwards? Beyond the potential migrants themselves, who do you think of as being the main stakeholders here? And how could you imagine these results informing policy?
Thanks, Gareth. So IPS process for disseminating findings usually involves a couple of steps. First, we identify key stakeholders to share information with. Typically, these would be policymakers, practitioners, and researchers. So for instance, in this case, the National Agency for the Prohibition of Trafficking in Persons, NAPTIP, is a key stakeholder that we would like to engage in the study results and think about how this might be used, especially as it relates to the information campaigns that they do, which is a big part of their programming. And so we'll map out other stakeholders to engage with who work in the human trafficking space here by identifying the key priorities, the alignment with the study, and pathways to influence their work. Now, once we have this list, we'll create a dissemination plan, which may include another webinar like this, or a group dissemination event, or targeted one-on-one meetings with these stakeholders to share the results and discuss with them how this might inform their current or planned policies or programs. And also think about some program adjustments that may need to be made based on the results, and further testing and iterations. Now, from our experience, we realize that applying results to policy requires additional technical assistance from IPA, as well as local policy and implementation experts. So we will hold some path to influence discussions to help partners move forward into the next steps of applying this type of research. And again, this typically would involve helping to chart some specific paths towards policy influence, planning to meet some of the challenges from implementation, and also detailing some new research that may need to be added.
Thanks, Emeka. Okay, we're going to open now to general discussion. So please continue to drop your questions into the chat box. I'm going to cycle back to some that were posed while we were talking. One is from Alison Grossman, who has an important question about measurement here. So how confident can we be that you successfully tracked participants? How exactly did you manage to kind of keep good records about who was where? Alex, do you want to take that?
I actually think Bernd would be perfect to take that one.
Sure. Yeah. So it's a challenge, and what we try to do is just have multiple avenues for collecting information on where people are and if they have tried to migrate. So we conducted individual interviews, but also interviews with heads of households, or if they weren't available, other members, senior members of a household. And also conducted tracking surveys with, for example, neighbors or work colleagues or others in the vicinity who might have information about what happened to someone. Now, that's actually a smaller share because households usually don't relocate in their entirety. So usually there's someone from the household still around who we can talk to and then obtain some information. But that's an important point. The information about whether people migrated, whether they try to migrate, it comes to a certain extent from most individuals themselves, but not entirely. Right? So a good portion of that information comes from others who stayed behind.
Kashimana Evo asks about the possible role of culture and ethnicity in these kind of migration patterns. Is there a role for culture and ethnicity? Did that feature in your study at all?
Okay, fantastic. So kind of recapitulating something Bernd said earlier. So this is highly concentrated to Edo State and even, within Edo State to Benin City. And when we look at who's interested in migrating and who migrates, and you look at ethnicity, it really maps on very accurately to just the basic distribution of ethnic groups. So it's not like within this context, there's like one ethnic group that's really doing this more than others. I mean, you see like the largest group does it the most, so on and so forth. But the kind of bigger question of why this part of Nigeria is really interesting. And, clearly this RCT can't get at that, but it's something you can't help but wonder about and kind of start reading about. And so, unfortunately, it's completely overdetermined, but this region of Nigeria has several great universities. It's a very educated population, and kind of the primary economy, the rubber economy, collapsed. So there's a very educated and underemployed and frustrated population. Okay, that's right. That's not exclusive to this region in Nigeria. And, the more you read, I think there's some things that are structural, to do with the economy, but there's also some random component to this. So, we've been trying really hard to figure out if this is just urban legend, but everyone you ask talks about this kind of infamous flight that was chartered in the 1980s from Benin City to Italy, where female migrants were supposed to work in agricultural jobs and ultimately wound up being forced to work in sex work. But that, this started this process back in the 80s. And then as, migration scholars will tell you, migration is incredibly networked. Like once it starts for whatever reason, it really, really, really snowballs.
Thanks, Alex. And a couple of questions coming up about sort of heterogeneity, both, among individuals in how they responded to the treatments, but also potentially across some of the decompositions of the treatments that I sort of you did later on. Are there any sort of parts of that you feel you've analyzed at this stage, and sort of there are results there that you think it's time to communicate?
Yeah, we're still pushing on those. So not yet, but that's an important point, in particular with respect to the decomposition of the treatment. So we also did and are still in the process of completing a second experiment where only portions of the intervention was delivered to particular randomly selected households, because we wanted to figure out, which of these components actually did the work here. But that's still in process. So we're still collecting more data, also following up, to see if we can reduce attrition even further. So we've already have information on something like 3/4 of our sample, but of course we want to push that even higher. And in the process of that, we're also collecting more details on that will help us decompose some of these effects.
Sorry, Bernd is like being so responsible. So we are still analyzing this. But an obvious heterogeneous effect that you want to look at is like, what are the prior beliefs? Like, is this more effective for people who had this or that or the other prior beliefs? And we're not 100% there. But interestingly, while it seems rather generally effective, the intervention, we're not seeing a strong difference between various measures of, prior expectations. So people who are better informed or who are less well informed, they don't seem to be reacting differently to this information. Similarly, people who have family members who migrated before or not also don't really seem to be reacting differently. And this kind of underscores something we said before, that this is really like murky. Even if you have a family member in Europe right now, that's not necessarily a guarantee that you have better information or that you'll react to the information in a different way.
Great. And Anna asks a really interesting question. Is you've figured out a way here to sort of correct misinformation in this kind of really potent manner. Is there anything we can learn? How can we generalize from this to correcting information in other contexts? What are some takeaways from your study in that regard?
Maybe I'll start, and Bernd, you can jump on it or disagree with me if I'm saying something wrong. So, I mean, this is a very pessimistic moment to be working on an information intervention. Many people in the EGAP network, including Gareth, have spent years looking at information and political behavior and finding, for example, in the first Metaketa project, and finding null result after null result. So, we definitely came to this with some pessimism, but a couple of reasons why this might be effective is that, first of all, it's not like some sort of collective action, like, pressuring your politicians to provide better public services. This is like an individual or at the most household level decision. It's highly salient. This is information that people in this setting really want to know. And it's information they can take and just act on their own. They don't have to kind of coordinate with others or anything like that. So, like, there's been a lot of reflection on what are the types of structural conditions or conditions of the situation that make information more effective. I think this is one of those situations. So we kept it focused on something people really wanted to know, that it's a decision people are themselves considering. So that's really important. Hopefully after our second experiment, we'll have a little more to say on this. I'd love to find out that, like, helping people see motivated reasoning so visibly. Like, so guess what? 500 people in this community a few years ago thought X. IOM and all these other guys think Y. And look at this, because it's very stark difference. So maybe that was effective, but we don't really know yet.
Yeah, actually, just to add to that last point, I think that's one component effect, I suppose, that we have spent some time looking at, and it does seem that that disconnect between what people think happens to Nigerians in general and what would happen to them personally if they tried, which is vast at baseline, and which we try to show, right, how vast of a disconnect that is in our intervention. That didn't really seem to do very much in terms of reducing this type of motivated reasoning at endline, which is interesting, right? So that kind of optimism about what you yourself can achieve, we couldn't really break. Perhaps it's also, a hopeful message to a certain extent.
Thanks, Bernd. Emeka, we have a question sort of more about the local context and potentially the role of religion in sort of affecting how people may have internalized the treatments or sort of the research environment in general. Did that sort of come up in the course of conducting the fieldwork? Uchenna Ifobi thinks, this is a highly religious sort of area. Was religion a part of this at all when you were running the study?
It's hard to say because this wasn't really a key focus of this research, and there wasn't really a lot of diversity in terms of religion in the states that we worked in, Edo and Delta. They were mostly Christian locations, so it's difficult to tell really from the data we have.
Got it. So it wasn't a sort of salient part of running this study in this case. Graham sort of has a question about ethics again, and sort of this sort of study could spur sort of many others. Are there any kind of so the way he puts it, how can we sort of make future studies meet ethical standards? What monitoring should we do to detect problems during interventions? What should red lines be and how should we determine them? Are there any sort of things we can draw from your study that speak to the ethics of these sorts of interventions in future, Alex?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a really important question. I'm not so sure about, like, once the RCT got going, this is something we were kind of thinking about as it was unfolding. But a couple of things that we tried to do, partly really because we were encouraged by the EGAP community. So, we took this very slow. We showed up in 2017 or 2018 with like an RCT plan to a meeting, maybe in Nairobi, an EGAP meeting. And the room basically said, slow down. So we sort of really, we took the time to like do a first fully qualitative set of interviews with migrant returnees who had varying experiences. Then we went back and did this smaller pre-survey, and we just tried to collect as much information as possible at all of these earlier stages. And I think without this information, there's so many things that we wouldn't have known that matter, not just from a scientific standpoint, but from an ethical standpoint. I think we were in an enormously privileged position to have the entire attention of an EGAP meeting to basically say, let's all think about this together. And we had been so worried about discouraging migration and feeling like awful about that. And, because it goes without saying, but maybe we should say it, like Bernd and I think a diverse Europe is the best Europe. And, so we just kept thinking we're going to discourage this thing. And we really hadn't thought about accidentally encouraging and possibly leading to disastrous consequences. So I would say, go slow, have many parts to this before you, rush in and try and do the RCT.
Thanks. Yang Yang has an important question about possible changes you might recommend to this intervention in future, possibly to avoid this unintended consequence of deterring migration locally, which may be economically beneficial. So what kind of tweaks, adjustments could you consider to this intervention to possibly kind of push back against that effect? Bernd, any suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, I think one obvious addition might be to just speak in the intervention about domestic or regional migration opportunities and make that part of the treatment, right? Provide alternative paths. That wasn't part of what we were doing, but that's sort of an obvious next step, and see what effects that might have.
Thanks. Always space for more experimentation, and this sounds like a key area to do that. Chris Grady has a question about the kind of the implementation details, and especially to do with the enumerators. Emeka, I was wondering if you could say something here. Do you think the persuasiveness or charisma of the enumerator was important here, especially delivering such a long informational treatment? What kind of training went into that?
It was quite extensive, and it was one that we collaborated with the research team on. And it was an extensive treatment, and one that required people to watch the entirety of the videos. So one we monitored carefully as well to make sure that it was being properly delivered. So there is possibility that the charisma and effectiveness of the enumerators would play a key part in a study like this.
Great. Okay, thank you, Emeka. Auro Gonzalez asks, how did those who migrate change in other respects after migration? Is that something that your survey instruments and tracking procedure would allow you to observe?
Yeah, so a further step, which we haven't taken yet, is to actually look at outcomes beyond migration, right? So look at actual well-being. So we collected data on that as well. Obviously, that's trickier in some sense in terms of attrition, because with respect to our behavioral outcomes of interest, right, we were able to reduce attrition by talking to other people, other household members who might be able to tell us whether someone tried to migrate regularly. But that's not necessarily something you can do when it comes to certain other outcomes. But that's the next step to figure out, what are the actual, and I think that's also important from our perspective, is not just to look at migration outcomes, but to also ask, what are the effects beyond migration? What are the welfare effects that these interventions can have?
Thanks. Okay, we're just in the last 2 minutes now. Alex, Emeka, and Bernd, are there any sort of final words you'd like to say about this study to wrap things up?
Thank you so much, Gareth. I'm seeing stuff in the chat, but maybe we can just follow up with people separately if there's a way to save it, because I'd love to talk about some of these other issues like spillovers. The sample size for the RCT was 2,800 households. So 2,800 households. And, even talking to everyone that we could in the households, you get up to about 6,000 people. So, but even so, we're a bit crunched for power. Yes, okay, so thank you everyone. These were really important and interesting questions, and that will really make us think a lot. On the ethical questions, these are so crucial and we need to keep grappling with them, particularly thinking through the implications of the unintended possible discouragement of internal migration, say. That said, it's important to know that this is something that the EU is funding heavily, that European governments are doing this, and it's important to bring to light that this possibly negative consequence is out there, and also to then try and incorporate something different as we go forward, like Bernd mentioned, like we could even combine this with an encouragement of internal migration or an encouragement of migration within West Africa, for example. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. And just a kind of a reminder, so apologies if we didn't get to your specific questions, but you can visit the event page after our discussion and post your questions there, and a member of the research team will aim to answer them as soon as possible. So there is a forum online for continuing discussion about this project after we finish the seminar today. Emeka and Bernd, anything finally you'd like to add?
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, same here. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, huge thanks to Emeka, Bernd, and Alex for making time to discuss this really crucial and cutting-edge research. I learned a huge amount. Thank you too to Jacqueline Lever for facilitating and organizing this and doing a huge amount of work to bring this together, and to all of the sort of participants who joined us today for your engagement and interesting questions. Hope that you join us again for another of these events. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Gareth.